They say the aftermath of this missile strike, so it sure looks like damage was done. General Hertling, we had lots of lawmakers on yesterday before they knew that the president would be doing this, saying, oh, it would be very simple. You just take out the runways and thereby debilitate the Air Force. It sounds like it went a little further than that.
Well, no, I think you're going to see any kind of strike against an airfield, not only cratering the runway, which is important, but also going after, in this case, hardened facilities. You want to make sure that this airport, this airfield, cannot be used again. So they did crater the runways, they did strike the aircraft targets, they did strike the refueling facilities. When you're talking about 59 Tomahawks in the air, Allison, you're going to go after multiple targets with each missile. Single targets with multiple missiles. And so you're going to hit those hardened facilities 2 or 3 times in an attempt to make sure they're never used again. If there are aircraft underneath, you want to break through the top of those. I've seen many of these in combats where there's a hole right in the top of the hardened facility, and then a second missile goes in and perhaps destroys an aircraft in it. But as Spider will tell you, we're pretty sure there was probably not a whole lot of aircraft there. The Assad would have moved those in anticipation of these strikes. But this was a very bold, tactical retaliatory strike. If we listen to what both H.R. McMaster and Secretary Tillerson saying, this is not part of a campaign plan, not part of a strategic objective, but a one-time strike to send a message. And I would suggest that that message is not only physical in terms of the damage of an airfield where chemical strikes emanated from, but also very strong political. We're seeing the results of that from many nations this morning, to include NATO, which Secretary Mattis told about the strike beforehand, but also psychological. This is a game changer. People are saying, what is going to happen next? Even though both McMaster and Tillerson has said nothing's going to happen next, we have done the strike that we wanted to do to retaliate against this chemical weapon attack in Idlib.
Right, but you know, NATO and allied countries liking it doesn't mean that it was authorized by the UN Security Council, which it wasn't, and doesn't mean that it's going to qualify legally in the United States as retaliatory, right, General, because this was done by President Trump in what he called self-defense. David Gregory, that's going to be an interesting legal discussion, but at the end of the day, Congress allowed the president to do it, and that takes us to the politics of it. It seemed the biggest resistance to this would have been Trump's pre-existing position. There are tons of tweets to look at back in 2013, the time marker of another and more horrible chemical attack, if even imaginable to people right now. The numbers much huger. Then citizen Trump said to President Obama, don't go in, it's not worth it. And he was saying the same thing now. Tillerson, Haley saying Assad is for Syria to deal with. And then in the span of 24 hours, everything changed.
You know, and President Trump, who right out of the gate blamed President Obama's inaction in 2013 for emboldening Assad and the Syrian regime, had his own hand in emboldening him just in the past few days by saying that there was no reason to displace him from power from the United States perspective. Those comments from Secretary Tillerson. Well, now, looking at these strikes from within the Oval Office was different from outside the Oval Office, and the populist America First president has now decided that he wants to be the moral leader astride the world stage. But it's still a question of what the end game is here. I don't think we can say with any certainty that this strike, yes, it might have gotten everybody's attention. Does it really degrade Syria's ability to deliver another chemical weapons strike? And by the way, why were the chemical weapons still there? I thought there was a big agreement to get them out of the country. What happened with that? And is this the prelude, as generals were saying, well, is this a one-time strike? Look, Syria, other countries in the Middle East, we've been at war here since 2001. I think people understand the United States is not going to commit ground forces to try to effect regime change, and all that that would require in the middle of a 6-year civil war. So what is the objective ultimately? To degrade the use of chemical weapons? To topple Assad? One thing that's clear this morning is that now there is more of a collision course between President Trump and President Putin. What's the ask? What's the demand of Russia when it comes to reining in Assad or trying to move him out politically? These are now the questions that we move forward with.
Phil, how do you see it?
I think you got to look at a couple pieces on the chessboard. Look at the options the president had. He chose a narrow option against one airfield. You've got to believe there are a couple of other options on the table, and some of the news reports out of Mar-a-Lago indicate that. One of them would have been a broader strike against the air capability in Syria, other airfields, to prevent the Syrian Air Force from attacking civilians. Note that he did not, that is, the president did not authorize, evidently, any attacks against regime targets, for example, presidential palaces. So you have a message that was clearly sent against a narrow set of targets. Meanwhile, the comments by the Russian foreign minister, I would say fairly restrained in advance of Secretary of State Tillerson's visit there next week. So to pick up on David Gregory's point, the president didn't go after regime change. He went after sending a specific message on chemical weapons. I've got to believe the talking points for Secretary Tillerson are quite straightforward, and they don't have to do with the strike. They have to do with next steps. What are we going to do about Assad? One final point on this. The Russians have paid virtually nothing for their interference in Syria so far, and I do not believe they will see this as a serious price they've paid for being there. So if we believe that these strikes will accelerate conversations with the Russians about ousting Assad, I don't think that's true.
Panel, please stick around. We will rely on you throughout our rolling breaking news coverage. There was swift reaction from the Assad regime to the U.S. strikes. We will tell you reaction from the Middle East and more.